Welcome to Age of the Obsolete, the weekly podcast that examines the intersection of technology, democracy, and the future of work. I'm your host, John Ravito. John Gass's painting, American Progress, is a timeless evocation of the American dream. Destiny, shown as an angelic white-robed woman, leads the march across the American West, from St. Louis, Missouri, to the Rocky Mountains and beyond. Before her, an Indian travois precedes a covered wagon and the Pony Express, followed by the overland stage and finally the railroad. Though depicted in a hagiographic manner more akin to myth than actual reality, the painting nevertheless promotes a powerful possibility of westward expansion and America's manifest destiny. The term manifest destiny was first employed in 1845 by magazine editor John L. O'Sullivan in an article on the annexation of Texas. It expressed the belief that it was the providential mission of Anglo-Saxon Americans to expand their civilization and institutions across the continent. This expansion would involve not merely territorial acquisition, but promote both liberty and economic opportunity.
People think of it as the official policy of territorial expansion, the idea that blessed America to become an ocean-bound republic in the 19th century. But the truth is, presidents and secretaries of state, they didn't use the phrase manifest destiny. It was the slogan of a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan, who invented it in 1845 when he was writing editorials about the annexation of Texas and about the boundary dispute with Britain over the Oregon Territory. He said it was blessed by Providence. It was the manifest destiny of the country to become this continental power. In fact, a lot of manifest destiny advocates, people who believed in territorial expansion, they felt like they had failed. They didn't think the country was spreading widely enough. They wanted all of Mexico. They wanted Canada. They wanted the entire continent to be part of the American Republic. The phrase actually kind of disappeared from American political life until the 1890s, when it was reborn as part of the drive to make the United States a global power. Some people began to talk about expanding into the Caribbean or the Pacific. This is the era of the Spanish-American War, and that's when it became ever more popular.
With the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the latter half of the 19th century, the belief in unbridled economic opportunity gave rise to a new class of entrepreneur. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, and Andrew Carnegie, all of whom refashioned the material basis of American civilization. Today, when we think of the post-Civil War era, we think of unbounded prosperity and conspicuous consumption, of the gay 90s, Currier and Ives lithographs, and a Gilded Age defined by great mansions, violent coastline. But there was a darker side to it all. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a paper entitled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. According to Turner, the American frontier had no need for aristocrats or nobles, nor for a governing gentry who controlled most of the land and charged heavy rents. The American frontier had, in fact, broken free of the European model of class oppression and was the true birthplace of democracy.
Coarseness and strength, acuteness and inquisitiveness, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism which comes with freedom. These are the traits of the frontier. This expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnishes the forces dominating American character.
Yet contrary to Turner's claims, the American frontier was anything but free. The farther west the settlers went, the more dependent they became on the railroads to move their goods to market. Because of their undue dominance, the railroads were able to charge rates that were considered by the settlers to be both unjust and unreasonable. When mandated by the courts to amend their practices, the railroads refused to comply. By 1890, with the level of agrarian distress at an all-time high, farmers from around the country came together to form what became known as the Populist Party. Meeting in Omaha, Nebraska, the Populist platform read, "We are met in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench. Injustice are bred two great classes, millionaires and tramps." The situation in the cities was even worse. Between 1890 and 1910, more than 18 million immigrants entered the country in search of work. What they found was long hours, low wages, and hazardous conditions. So hazardous that as late as 1900, the United States had the highest job-related fatality rate of any industrialized nation in the world. Most factory workers toiled at a 10-hour day, yet earned from 20 to 40 than the minimum deemed necessary for a decent life. The situation was even worse for children, whose numbers in the workforce doubled between 1870 and 1900. To fully understand the state of exploitation that savaged the working classes, we need only look to the photos of Jacob Riis. In his now classic book of photography titled How the Other Half Lives, Riis exposed squalor and degradation of tenement life in New York City. What we see are men, women, and children living in deplorable conditions that stand in stark contrast to the halcyon visions promoted by Frederick Jackson Turner and his adherents.
The images Riis brought back brought wealthy and middle-class New Yorkers face to face with a reality most had long sought to avoid. Their city had become home to more than 1 million overworked and undernourished people, often living in conditions of unspeakable horror. He went everywhere, carrying his camera down obscure courtyards and back ways, with names like Ragpicker's Row, Blind Man's Alley, and Bottle Alley. In a place called Bandit's Roost, he photographed a dozen men, all said to be wanted for murder. He was especially moved by the plight of the young, the ragged street Arabs who sold newspapers by day and slept in alleys by night. The child laborers who often worked 7 days a week in stifling factories and sweatshops. And the tens of thousands of abandoned and orphaned children who had been left to fend for themselves. But what horrified him most was the unspeakable conditions in which so many
In a few short decades, greed and venality had reduced the promise of American progress to a state of social Darwinism, a dog-eat-dog philosophy that would cause John D. Rockefeller, at that time the richest man in the world, to comment that the growth of a large business is merely the survival of the fittest. Was this the only way? There were those who thought otherwise. Social justice is the idea that all members of society deserve an equal footing in terms of opportunities, political rights, and the distribution of wealth so that they can lead fulfilling lives and realize their potential in the community. It was a belief in social justice that gave rise to American progressivism, a political movement and philosophy that ran from the late 19th century through the first decades of the 20th century. Carrying the banner of social justice, the progressive movement sought to reform the economic, political, and cultural inequalities due to the rapid changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution and the growth of modern capitalism. Listen as Theodore Roosevelt extols the virtues of American progressivism during the presidential campaign of 1912.
The present condition of living cannot be accepted as satisfactory. There are too many who do not prosper enough, and of the few who prosper greatly, there are certainly some whose prosperity does not mean welfare for the country. Our aim is to promote prosperity and then to see that prosperity around, that there is a proper division of prosperity.
Where capitalism sought to treat labor as just another factor of production, the progressives sought to address the human element inherent, arguing that the purpose of economic activity is not simply to create wealth, but to also increase the well-being of the individual. It was because of the efforts of the progressives and the like-minded individuals that followed them that reforms finally came about. Reforms that would reduce the work week, bar children from the factories, increase wages, and implement safeguards against hazardous working conditions. Today we live in a world in which the physical and psychological nature of work is far removed from the debilitating practices of the past, and yet inequalities still remain. According to the most recent 2015 census, an estimated 43 million Americans fall below the poverty line. A quarter of Americans earn less than $10 an hour, while the top 1% account for the lion's share of the country's wealth. According to research, of earning more than his or her parents has fallen from 90% to 50% over the past half-century. And then there's the future. Presented with the threat of artificial intelligence and automation, offshoring and e-commerce, economists estimate that nearly 47% of American jobs may soon be replaced. If this occurs, what will be our response? Will we simply shrug like John D. Rockefeller and attribute the massive loss of jobs to free market economics and the survival of the fittest? Or will we side with the progressives of an earlier age and search for solutions grounded in social justice and respect for the individual? This is John Revito saying thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or want additional information on any of the topics covered in these podcasts, our website at ageoftheobsolete.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.